Well, the stars blazed bright, showed brave men the way. Under guns by night is where they'd lay, with a land so old and harsh, much to be uncovered. These stories we will tell on Australia Rediscovered. Come hear about it all with Rico on Australia Rediscovered.
Yes, there you go. It's my old mate up there from Charters Towers, Tony Cook, pumping it out for us once again. Geez, he does a great job. Welcome to the third episode of the Australia Rediscovered podcast, and welcome to my very good mate, Dingo Dave. How you travelling now, mate?
Hey, Rico, bit chilly down here today, mate. Bit chilly, but I'm not complaining.
Where are you at the moment, mate?
Still in the nation's capital for another couple of days. Got a fair bit of work on down here, so I'm not complaining about that at all. You know, cold morning, but absolutely stunningly beautiful days. So that is the trade-off.
Very good. Well, things could be worse, couldn't they? At least we're starting to get back out there now, so life is good.
That's right. I think I have a plan to get to Fraser Island in the next 2 weeks. Sorry about that.
Good on you. I might have to boot you off this podcast, mate. You're starting to upset me a bit.
Sorry, bro.
All right, so the first two episodes we've done, we did Sturt and Leichhardt, and we've had some great feedback there, so thank you to everyone for that. We really enjoy hearing your words of encouragement and the odd little pick up there on people that are sort of fact-checking us and stuff like that. That's all good. We love that.
Nice.
This time we've got Edward John Eyre. So Eyre is a pretty famous name in terms of exploring circles, but also when you look around the country, particularly around South Australia region, you'll see the name Eyre pop up a lot, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So Edward John Eyre, he was born in August in 1815 in a place called Whipsnade. Whipsnade, what a cracker of a name that is, in Bedfordshire in England. So he was the third son of Anthony and Sarah Eyre, and Anthony, get this, he was the vicar of Hornsea and Longriston. I know a vicar.
Do you?
Yeah,
Does he know you?
You know a vicar as well.
I do, really?
Our cameraman Sean is a vicar.
Oh,
A vicar,
I guess he is,
a pastor, one of those guys. Yeah, he puts up with us.
And a Dead Set Legend cameraman.
And a Dead Set Legend cameraman. Dead Set Legend bloke. He's a champion.
How did that happen?
Yes, good on you, Sean. We know you're enjoying the podcast as well, mate. Stick around, you might learn something.
I spent the weekend with Sean, actually. That was good.
Very good. Anthony's son, Edward, he was educated at just a couple of very ordinary schools, one at Louth and one at Sedberg. Finished school and he intended to join the army at the age of 17, but did not because his old man suggested that he use that coin. And back in the day, you had to pay to join the army, which is just bizarre. But anyway, he suggested that he use that coin to emigrate to Australia instead. So fancy that, eh? You're fresh out of school and your old man says, hey, why don't you pack your bags and go halfway around the country?
That's right. See you later. How's that for a schoolies week?
Yeah, schoolies week indeed. We didn't even have a Gold Coast back then. All right, so we arrived in Sydney on a ship called the Ellen in March 1833, and I'll always include that little detail because if you're like me, you'll want to know if your ancestors maybe came out in the same ship.
That's true.
Actually, my family go back to, I think it's 1836 they came out, so not too far, and they came from Ireland, right when the potato famine thing was happening, so...
Wow, maybe our family was on the same boat, Rico.
Maybe. Maybe we're brothers, Dingo.
We may be.
Yes. Yeah, so he arrived in Sydney in March 1833 and he hadn't even turned 18 yet, so how about that? He got here and found that there wasn't much doing, no real prospects, so he moved up north to the Hunter River district, which seemed to be a fairly popular thing to do at the time. It was pumping up there, so he actually got a job from a bloke called Henry Dumoresque. Now, Dumoresque is also a pretty famous name back in the day. Henry and his brother William, they were colonial officers, and I guess you could call these blokes controversial because there's a lot of things written about them. But the thing that I found intriguing about Henry Dumoresque was that he was a noted duellist. That was back in the day when you'd slap your mate across the face with a glove and say, "You, sir, you and me out the front."
To be a noted duellist, does that mean you've done it twice?
Well, it means you're not dead. It's always a good start if you're going into a duel. You have insulted my honour. So Henry, the colonial officer and the noted duellist, he got him a job and somewhere to live. Pretty soon he was working in sheep and cattle management, and it turns out that he was bloody good at it. So as we'll find out later on, he'll put those skills to very good use. So Henry sort of set him up for a life that would be very interesting, but also, again, as we'll learn, it turned out to earn him quite a few dollars as well. Within the first couple of months, he actually purchased his own very first flock of sheep, 400 of the woolly little buggers. And the following year, in 1834, he took up a property near Queanbeyan, so down near where you are, Dingo. In fact, 1,260 acres.
Good sheep country.
Yeah, it's not bad for an 18-year-old, is it?
That's pretty impressive, mate.
Yeah. You know what? He's actually a pretty impressive man, I've got to say. Old mate Eyre, doing some research this week, and gee whiz, he did a lot. He did a lot. So the following year, he put his stock management to good use, and he herded 3,000 sheep from Liverpool to the property at Queanbeyan. Now, not long after this, he was having some issues with sheep disease and things like that, so he actually sold up at Queanbeyan and headed back to Sydney. Now, it was interesting because while he was in Sydney, he actually met Charles Sturt, who we spoke about in the first podcast that we did. By this time, Sturt had 2 major expeditions under his belt, and this meeting really had an influence on Eyre and Eyre's perspective on life going forward. You got to think about like the mid-1830s there in Sydney. What a time for explorers. We had Sturt, had Eyre, had Leichhardt, Mitchell, all at the same time in and around the same area. There was a couple others as well.
And they weren't comparing notes on Instagram. They weren't comparing notes on Facebook. Like they had to actually... They were literally occupying the same places. They weren't just sort of online collaborators. They actually did at times cross each other's paths and get together and share stories. And, as we discussed with Sturt, was, quite often in opposition to, bidding for the same project.
Yeah, that's right.
Certainly...
Thomas Mitchell didn't get along with any of them. He hated them all. Every time he didn't get a job and one of them did, that was it. Enemy for life. Yes, the collab. Bailey comes in to me all the time saying, I'm doing a collab on Instagram or Twitch or some other sort of thing that I don't do. Yeah, so there you go. Bit of a tangent there. He met Sturt, which was cool. And like I said, Sturt had a couple of big trips already under his belt. And he'd obviously had a bit of a chat to Eyre about some of the things that he'd done. And Eyre came away with a new perspective. But unfortunately for him, he couldn't act on it straight away because he'd already committed to take a big mob of cattle and sheep, back 78 cattle, 414 sheep, oxen and horses were all part of this great big mob. He was going to take them from Queanbeyan down to Port Phillip in Melbourne. And 5 months later, he made it to Melbourne and he sold the stock for a very, very tidy profit. By October, he was back in Sydney with plans to be the first to arrive in Adelaide overland from Sydney. So it's hard to believe that no one had actually gone from Sydney to Adelaide overland.
That's it. Like this, the route was open, if you like, by sea, but no one had actually yet ventured west. The people, they knew people lived in Adelaide, they knew people lived in Sydney, they knew they could get there by the ocean, but they hadn't yet found a way to get across over the mountains. It's pretty incredible stuff. Yeah,
so by October, he was back in Sydney. He wanted to be the first to do that, and this is where the Sturt influence was starting to really become apparent. At this point, you could say an explorer was born, really. This is where Eyre has gone, this is it, I'm going to find a way. Now, it's interesting because he's not a trained explorer as such in the ways that people like Mitchell and Leichhardt, and even Sturt to a degree, certainly were. He's not a navigator, he's not a botanist, he's not any of those things. So it's a big
not
call.
In the army.
So with the money he made from driving the stock to Melbourne, he'd assembled an expedition and he decided he was going to continue to do what was making money. And he'd go there, he'd go to Adelaide, but he'd take 300 head of cattle with him as well and sell those when he got there. So he left from Limestone Plains, again, near Canberra, down in, I think we should start calling it Dingo Country, down there. Seem to spend a lot of your time there.
It does seem to keep me here for a while, but that's all right. I don't mind.
So, yeah, he left Limestone Plains on January 3rd, 1838, and he was joined by his overseer and good mate, John Baxter, a couple of weeks later. Now, Baxter would go on to accompany Eyre on just about all of his exploration expeditions, but you never hear his name, not like Burke and Wills or Human Hovel. There's a lot of expeditions where there's a couple of names in there. Now, Baxter was involved on all of these trips. You don't see his name anywhere, which is bizarre.
No, it was kind of interesting to see how often it wasn't highlighted, that there wasn't, in my research this week, how many sources didn't have any further information on him. It's a bit disappointing, really.
Yeah, I found the same thing, actually. So Eyre loosely followed Sir Thomas Mitchell's route to the Wimmera. Now, the Wimmera is around the Grampians region in southwest Victoria. Continue on from there, heading west, and he discovered and named Lake Hindmarsh. But in the end, lack of water just made it too hard. He could not find that shorter route to Adelaide, and he had to follow the Murray instead, as others had before him. He wasn't too happy about that. It's interesting to note that he said for this journey he didn't have any dramas with the Aboriginals, and a lot of people had. So Thomas Mitchell certainly had. Sturt had a couple of run-ins with them along the river as well. He said that he found them friendly, and he's dealing with the way that he dealt with Indigenous people, not just here but in other parts of the world, would have a massive part on his future life as well, which we'll talk about later on. So while he didn't find the route that he was looking for, financially the trip was a success, so he soon did another one, and this time with more stock. Now this trip, how much money do you reckon he made out of it?
I don't know. How do oldie time coins work, mate?
Oldie time coins. Well, he made, the trip itself netted over £4,000, and half of that was his. So in today's money, that's worth about $500,000.
Sheesh.
It's not bad, is it?
That's one cashed up young explorer. That'll
set you up for quite a few things. Mm-hmm. But this time, when he got there, he stayed in Adelaide, and he bought a cottage, or built a cottage, on an acre of land, which was, you think about it, it's the original Great Australian Dream, an acre and a house. But he wanted to do some exploring north of Adelaide. The exploring bug had really set in by this point. So he set out in May of 1839. So he reached the top of the Spencer Gulf, and he continued further north to the beautiful Flinders Ranges, where we've spent a fair bit of time, haven't we, mate?
Now and then, we have popped in and out of there, haven't we? There's still so much to explore, though.
Oh,
go back.
Happy to go back any time. Now, I said earlier, it's worth noting that explorers like Leichhardt, Mitchell and Gregory and others, they were noted surveyors. A lot of them actually took up positions, government positions, as surveyors and navigators and things like that. He was none of those. He wasn't even a scientist, geologist, botanist. He was just a really good leader of men, obviously, and he had a real passion for adventure and exploration. I'm awestruck by his ability to get himself around the country like this.
And it just seems to have been, certainly in those early years, just to be free from controversy. It was always small groups. It was always practical nature. There was no fanfare. He wasn't sort of, at the bequest of people doing things. He was just out there exploring. And, for those early ones, it was on a mission. It was, opening up stock routes. It was, there was very real and tangible reasons to do the travelling. But again, the overriding nature of all of his expeditions were small practical groups.
Yeah, that's right. Although that controversy would eventually find him. So from the Flinders, he struck north until he reached the shorelines of the massive Lake Torrens. Have you ever been to Lake Torrens?
I haven't.
It is amazing. Absolutely amazing. When we were up in the Flinders last time, we went to a station called Moonamora. And at Moonamora, on one side it heads out to Wilpenna Pound, and on the other side it goes out to Lake Torrens. The drive out to Lake Torrens is amazing. And when you get there, it is just unfathomably huge. You can't take it all in. It's massive. And he said of the lake in his journal, and this is, I keep talking about it, the way they spoke back then is really cool.
I love it.
So he said, the whole of it was barren and arid looking in the extreme, and as I gazed on the dismal scene before me, I felt assured I had approached the vast and dreary desert of the interior, or, it might be, was verging on the confines of some inland water whose sterile and desolate shores seemed to forbid the traveller's approach.
Fantastic.
Now, this is a bloke who finished school at 17, no university degrees, worldwide education like a lot of these other blokes, but still he can string a sentence together, can't he?
Oh, he can. I actually found his two books, or his book that was split into two sections, all written in the third person, all written extremely formally. It's quite a read, actually.
I love it.
Yeah, you've got to delve, you've got to commit yourself, but just love the language.
Now, he wasn't satisfied with what he found on this trip, so he headed back to Adelaide with a view to heading west this time. Yeah, Lake Torrens sort of stopped him in his tracks. He's come back home, and he's gone, that's it, I'm going to go west this time and see what's out there, because this lake is obviously putting a bit of a damper on things. So he crossed the Spencer Gulf via a boat and landed in Port Lincoln on his 24th birthday. So he was still very young, wasn't he? He and his old mate John Baxter left Port Lincoln with 2 Aboriginal boys. He crossed what we now know as, believe it or not, the Eyre Peninsula, and continued around to Streaky Bay. Streaky Bay is another beautiful part of the world as well. Some great fishing over there. From here, the boys headed north, where they discovered and named the Gawler Ranges, and back past Lake Torrens, which he had also named, by the way, before heading back to Adelaide. In his report on the journey, Eyre wrote, I cannot but regret that there have not been more productive of interest and utility to the colonists, during the whole of our course of 600 miles, which is just shy of 1,000 k's, though I believe and hitherto unexplored country, we never crossed a single creek, river or chain of ponds, nor did we meet with permanent water anywhere with the exception of 3 solitary springs on the coast. So to sum all of that up, basically the land he explored on this particular trip, Eyre Peninsula around a Streaky Bay, up into the Gawler Ranges, back to Lake Torrens and back to Adelaide, he said it was crap. It was no good to anybody. He didn't think anyone had been there before. They never crossed a creek, a river or a chain of ponds, and they found 3 solitary springs on the coast. Tell you what, tough trip.
Absolutely. And then, you've done all this in order to find something. At what point do you say, there's just nothing here? It's time to turn around.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you think about it, you can continue on in any direction from there as well, and it doesn't get much better, does it?
Mad.
So yet again, it's another expedition that didn't really yield the sort of results that he was looking for. But being the stubborn and obviously very enterprising bloke that he was, he rounded up a mob of sheep and cattle yet again, and he sailed them across from Port Lincoln to King George Sound. That's in WA, where Albany is. So right down the bottom of WA there. Albany and King George Sound is another beautiful part of the world. That's just stunning country. So his plan was to overland the mob to the Swan River settlement, which is the current day Perth to sell, which he did. Now remember, this is obviously country he's never been into. He's caught a boat over there to Albany and decided he needs to get to, or what we call Perth, but the Swan River settlement. And he's managed to find his way there. And again, this is largely unexplored land. It's just blows my mind.
Following your nose again. Just knowing you needed to head west, knowing that there was a settlement. There has to have been some navigation skill there, isn't there, to be emerging after 1,000 kilometres of just heading west and managing to find your way into that one little speck of civilization.
How hard do you reckon it'd be to learn how to navigate celestially by the stars? Is this something you or I could do?
I reckon we could do it, but it'd be really hard not to cheat and check a GPS to see if we were right.
I think we should do it one night. We should give it a crack and see how we go.
I think we can. Like, giving it a red hot go is one thing, but then being able to trust it is
yeah, well. It'd be interesting to go out and then try and find your way back to where you started, wouldn't it?
It would be.
All right, so, yeah, he'd done this trip. He'd done what he set out to do. He made another pretty penny. Again, not a trained surveyor or navigator. It's just mind-blowing. He eventually came back to Adelaide. When he came back with him, he brought an Aboriginal with him that he had befriended named Wiley. He was also greeted with the news that a committee had been formed to organise an expedition to explore and find an overland route west. Now, obviously, people had been jumping on a ship and going over to King George Sound, Albany, and travelling up from there. Now, the government, they decided they wanted to be able to get there by land as well. So, of course, Eyre, being the courageous explorer that he'd now become, he offered up his services, and he even offered to pay a third of the cost. And in fact, he ended up paying a little bit more than half. I think that just goes to show how keen he was. Like, obviously, he's pretty cashed up. Mm-hmm. This was a time where people like Leichhardt and Sturt were going to the government with their hands out saying, hey, we want to go exploring, can you fund it? And yeah, Leichhardt sort of funded his first one, but after that, it was always government grants and so on. Eyre had obviously achieved a fair bit by this point and said, you know what, I'll go again, and I'll even pay for most of it.
Do you think that's because he was a bit further away from Melbourne, Sydney? That all that hive of activity was happening around Melbourne and Sydney, and that's where all the reputations were being made. Whereas he was, now basing himself out of Adelaide and even pushing it more remotely. I just wonder if the times and the places there.
I don't know.
Set up a sort of very different sort of framework.
I don't know, because Adelaide was a very political place at the time as well. Like, there was a lot of very influential people that ended up coming out of Adelaide. Like, you look at the names of the governors and things like that, they're all recognisable. I think, I'm not sure. I just don't know. I guess we never will because we weren't there.
This is the thing.
So he's convinced everyone that a route north would make more sense because he'd found the going pretty tough on his previous westward journey. So Governor George Gawler took his word for it and he called it a journey of discovery into the interior of Australia. So he's sitting there trying to talk it up a bit. So Eyre set out from Adelaide in June 1840 with 6 white men, including his old mate Baxter, 2 Aboriginal men, 13 horses, 40 sheep, and enough stores for 3 months. That's what they left with. Now, more provisions were also shipped up to the head of the Spencer Gulf on a boat. It was a government cutter called the Witchwater, I think it was. And they would meet up there, and that meant they didn't have to lug it, the first couple hundred k's. They struck north from his base at Mount Arden along the Flinders Ranges and then made several what they called exhausting thrusts. I love the terminology. Exhausting thrusts. And they reached Lake Torrens to the west. When they started heading east, they got to the southern arm of Lake Eyre. And to the north, they got to, a southern arm of Lake Eyre. And then to the north, they got further up to Lake Eyre. And then over to the east, they found Mount Hopeless. I've actually stood on top of Mount Hopeless.
Really?
It's not much of a mountain. I walked up it. And you know how big I am when I'm walking? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I got there and I was just going, really? That's a mountain? It's like Mount Druitt.
And here we are.
Okay, so he was disappointed that he hadn't been able to get too much further north than these sort of landmarks that we're talking about, but he had no intention of turning back. So he decided that they'd go over to Streaky Bay and start going westward and see if they could find somewhere that would let them go inland, some sort of watercourse that would eventually let them go inland and start going that direction before heading west again. So he sent Baxter and a couple of men and an Aboriginal over to Streaky Bay. Himself, he took the remainder of the expedition to Port Lincoln. Once he got there, he sent one of his boats back to Adelaide on a boat with a request for more provisions. And with the permission from his committee, he also got his Aboriginal mate Wiley to come back with him. By the 3rd of November, at this point they've been gone for quite some time. I think it's about 5 or 6 months. He rejoined Baxter and his party at Streaky Bay, and then they moved on and found a depot at Fowler's Bay. So they're very slowly making their way west. From there, on the third attempt, Eyre reached the head of the bight, but it was pretty tricky, and he decided to send all of the members of the expedition back to Adelaide, except for Baxter, his mate Wiley, and the 2 South Australian Aboriginal men. And with them, he intended to go 850 miles, or around about 1,400 k's, to King George Sound, with a determination either to accomplish the object I had in view or perish in the attempt. That's foolhardy. That's crazy. Why would you set yourself up for that sort of stuff?
Well, one of the comments I read was at one stage 135 miles of desert country was passed through without coming across water, and the whole party nearly perished.
Yep, that's insane.
That's what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, it's just over 200 k's of desert country.
Mm-hmm.
That's nuts. So they continued around the bight. Imagine the looks on their faces when they've come around there to this Great Australian Bight and just seen that endless coastline.
Oh, spectacular. But spectacular for us.
Yeah, that's right. Water everywhere and not a drop to drink. That's what they'd have been saying. They were met with the same difficulties, the terrain, the lack of water. And by the middle of April, they were also suffering from the cold because they'd had to chuck most of their clothing away. I don't know why. I couldn't find anything on that. They're half naked by this point, which is just crazy. Now,
not all things need to be recreated, though, Rico. I'd just like to point that out.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's one of those things we probably don't need to know.
No.
On the night of the 29th of April, 2 of the natives murdered Eyre's faithful mate, Baxter. Poor old Baxter was killed by the Aboriginals after all of this travelling with Eyre over the years. And then they disappeared with most of the provisions and the serviceable firearms. So basically left them with no guns, no tucker, and pretty crook. Here's what he had to say about it in his journal. At the dead hour of night in the wildest and most inhospitable wastes of Australia, with the fierce wind raging in unison with the scene of violence behind me, I was left with a single native whose fidelity I could not rely upon, and for whom I knew might be in league with the other 2, who perhaps were even now lurking about with the view of taking away my life as they had done that of the overseer.
Wow.
That's pretty hairy, really. When you sit down and consider that, that's pretty hairy.
Yeah, I hadn't come across that one. So well done, good research. I didn't spot that.
There you go. Cop this, though. In 1997, this is obviously a long time after the fact, I always struggle with some of these Aboriginal names, but I'll give it a crack. A Naju Murning man from the area, Arthur Dimmer, said it was Eyre who killed Baxter, not the Aboriginal.
Oh, there you go.
So they reckon Eyre killed Baxter in a fit of rage because Baxter was drunk. And the 2 South Australian Aboriginals, they fled in fright and they were speared by the Murning people, so that the tribe of the area who'd been observing the expedition's progress for quite some time. So apparently the stories told down through the generations is a little bit different to Eyre's reckoning of what happened.
Well,
once again, we'll never know, will we?
We will never know the truth.
So there's always some sort of, mystery, calamity, something like that happens on these trips, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you've just crossed, it must be, and people aren't in there. They're not in their happy places after 200 kilometres of desert with not a single creek or fresh water.
Yeah, that's right.
The stress of the toll it takes is...
And 7 or 8 months on the road behind them as well.
That's right.
I know what I'm like after being on the road for 3 weeks. You don't want to be around me. I'm miserable.
A week and a half, mate.
Hey, come on. Give me some credit.
Sorry, bro.
Reminds me of the Paxsaddle Roadhouse, but that's another story for another time. For over a month, Eyre and Wiley struggled on to the west until on the 2nd of June at Thistle Cove, which is near Esperance, they sighted a French whaler called the Mississippi, which picked them up and gave them several days' hospitality and also replenished their stores. For Eyre, well, he didn't care. He insisted on completing his journey to King George Sound. He could have copped a lift with this ship, but said, no, thanks for the tucker, thanks for the clothes, but we're going to keep on going. Moving on through the heavy rains and the cold weather, they actually reached Albany on the 7th of July, which is just amazing. Now, for this incredible journey, Eyre was awarded the Founders Gold Medal of the Royal Geographical Society in 1847. And the Society also published 3 of his papers. Now, we've spoken about the importance of this sort of stuff before to the explorers. Like you said, Dingo, it's like their resume, getting this sort of stuff published and helps them do other stuff later on.
It was. It's actually in his journal. He didn't actually get to do, not his journal, but his published works afterwards. He actually laments the fact that he was given his new position of Protectorate of the Aborigines because it didn't allow him to write his story for another 4 years.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
He wanted to get in and write his story, but he had a job and he took his job seriously, so that just had to wait. So it's a very cool paragraph in the foreword, the preface of his story.
Well, there you go. I didn't catch that bit either, so I guess we're filling in the blanks together here. Now, when he returned to Adelaide, he wrote to the governor of the time, which is Sir George Gipps, offering to lead an expedition from Moreton Bay to Port Essington, which we know from our last podcast that our good mate Dr. Leichhardt did.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, in October 1841, he accepted appointment as, you said, the resident magistrate and protector of Aborigines, with an annual salary of £300, and he was basically living on the Murray River, which was, I guess, there's worse places to hang about. But the interesting thing is that he had notable success in dealing with the Aboriginals, and that would come into that would be important later on in his life. In December 1844, Eyre was given leave and he sailed for England, taking with him a couple of Aboriginal boys to be educated in England at his expense. It's it's an interesting thing all its own. I had a bit of a look to see what became of the 2 Aboriginal boys, but I couldn't find anything. I'd love to know.
No, nor could I. That's a unfinished business, that one.
I'd love to know.
Need to know more there.
Yep. While he was on that voyage, he prepared his journals for publication. In 1846, cop this, he was appointed the Lieutenant Governor of New Zealand on a salary of £800 and a living allowance of £400. So that's massive, massive money back then. That's huge, huge money. That's like us being on, I'm guessing around $300,000 a year. So happy days for him. And he was based in Wellington. So have a think about it for a second. He's come over here at 17, fresh out of school, basically kicked out of the home by his old man, or not really, but, his old man suggested that, hey, why don't you come out here and have a crack? And in what is a reasonably short period of time, he's done some overlanding and made some serious coin right off his own bat. There's no handouts there. He's done some exploring and he's named some fairly notable places. He's done some, that one big epic trip over there to Albany where his mate was killed. And now he's been appointed a lieutenant governor of an entire country. It's quite amazing.
And still only a young bloke. I made some notes too that he discovered what was later called Mount Eyre and hadn't even turned 24.
It's just insane.
He discovered Lake Eyre at the age of 25, and all of this work in Australia was wrapped up roughly by the age of 30.
Yeah, so he was 31 when he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of New Zealand. Just insane. For someone with no qualifications, nothing more than a basic tertiary education, basically finished the equivalent of Year 12, I suppose, for us. That just blows my mind.
And now we have dozens of incredibly iconic locations named after a person who spent 12 years here.
Yep, that's just insane. Now, controversy was due to come his way, I guess, and this is where it all started. So the governor of the time, Sir George Grey, decided that he was going to withdraw the £400 a year living allowance and basically substitute it with a small forage allowance. Now, this caused a real rift between the governor and Eyre, and their relationship eventually became pretty bad. And although Eyre, wasn't exactly the gentleman either, he believed that Grey behaved in such a domineering fashion that Eyre's position became untenable, and he returned to England. So he returned to England in 1853, and in 1854 he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of St Vincent in the West Indies, whole nother part of the world. and he remained there until 1860, and he became the acting governor of the Leeward Islands. During this period, he proved himself to be a very capable, very humane administrator, and when you look back at his past relationship with Aboriginals and Indigenous Australians, that's no surprise. In 1861, he became the acting governor of Jamaica, and in 1864, he was appointed the governor-in-chief. For 3 years, this place was hell. It was the political environment over there was vicious and nasty. It's full of the Indigenous Jamaican people. There's very much a black and white thing going on over there. While Eyre only had temporary authority, he wasn't terribly popular. He wasn't a bad governor. But in 1865, he was faced with a serious Negro riot at a place called Morant Bay. Now, he interpreted this as the first step of a rebellion. So he immediately declared martial law, and the armed forces obviously began reprisals, and by the end of martial law in November, this had led to the killings or execution of 608 people, the flogging of over 600 people, and burning of 1,000 dwellings. So this is where things start to get a little bit sketchy for old mate Eyre.
Mm.
He went back to England. Sorry, mate.
There seems to be, sorry, Rico, just in reading this part of his history, there's two types of texts, okay? There seems to be a text where he is just out and out demonised, and then there's another set of texts which perhaps go into a little bit more detail of the machinations and how, maybe he wasn't actually pulling all the strings, or maybe some of his strings were being pulled externally. Regardless of that, horrible, horrible time in Jamaican history. But two, it's really, really difficult, I found, to actually get any kind of down-the-line recollection of that period. So it was, it's still very passionate. Like, I even came across some texts from the 1990s where new investigations had been conducted into what went on. So it was clearly a full-on, very, very passionate time to be alive in Jamaica, I suppose. But in 1865 there was a royal commission, and he was found that of 7 of the charges he was fully vindicated of 5, and then the other 2 he was not found to be the one responsible for what went on. So there was lots of investigations. He eventually was I guess, cleared. But yeah, really tough text to read, I've got to say, and 2 very, very different, polar opposite sets of stories.
And there were some big names that were up against him as well. One famous name, Charles Darwin, the scientist and...
Evolution, mate.
Evolution, that's the one. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, so he was very outspoken in what he thought should happen, and none of it was good for Eyre. But like you said, he was fully acquitted, to the point where even the British government ended up paying his legal expenses, which was nice for him in the end. But when you think about it, right, you go back to he made a friend in Wiley, the Aboriginal in Perth, or the Swan River settlement, and thought so much of him, he brought him back to Adelaide with him. And yet he's being accused of killing, 600 odd people in cold blood in Jamaica later on, just because they're Indigenous.
That was it. Like, it didn't sit well. Like, all of the stories of his time in Australia, at least the ones we know about, clearly, there's some controversy there. He did actually have quite a lot of success in working with the Aborigines in the various locations, and not just in one location. Like, as he moved across the country, to then have this all just go so bad. Was it right man in the wrong place? Was it a combination of things? Do we actually know what really went on? Certainly the story, there's no disputing the history, okay? There's no disputing what actually did happen at the time. But who led to things, who was pulling strings, I guess may just be one of those things that history may never give up that secret.
No, that's often the case when we're talking about these things. Now, here's the big question. Do you think that it detracts from his legacy?
Look, I've got to say it was never... I think his legacy for me for a long time was about Australian exploration. It wasn't... I've got to say I wasn't particularly aware of his New Zealand career, if you like, and then Jamaica. I don't know. I'm gonna sit on the fence, Rico. I think there's not enough... To me, there's not enough clarity around that to say that it could. Certainly his early works in Australia are amazing and opened up so much countryside, and should be honoured for the work there. And if these other allegations are proven true, then that starts to put a bit of a cloud on things, I guess. However, certainly the man that I had come to understand, and through my research, I'd considered him to be a hero explorer. I guess didn't know about these other the seriousness of these other allegations. So it's a tough one.
Well, my take on it is that I still think that he's a bit of a hero. He accomplished a lot, and he did it off his own bat. He paid for it himself. What he did manage to do here was pretty amazing. And even when he went to New Zealand and then he went to Jamaica, he still did a good job up until perhaps one rash decision, which he wouldn't have been able to understand the implications of over there. It's a completely different part of the world. So I still think he's done well. I think he's done very well.
Yep, fair enough.
All right, so let's have a look at some of the stuff that has been named after Edward John Eyre. Now, there's a statue of him in Adelaide's Victoria Square. We've got Lake Eyre, of course. We've all heard of Lake Eyre. The Eyre Peninsula, Eyre Creek, the Eyre Highway, which is the main highway from Adelaide over to Perth. The Edward John Eyre High School, the Eyre Hotel in Whyalla. I haven't been to that one, so now I have to go. The electoral district. They all seem to get electoral districts named after them. There's the district of Eyre in WA. It's quite a tongue twister. And over in New Zealand, you've got Ayrton, Airwell. There's a couple of suburbs, the Eyre Mountains, and another Eyre Creek. There you go.
Very cool.
All right, mate, well, what we might do is take a quick break, and we'll come back on the other side with a very special guest. We haven't spoken about our special guest today, so that's exciting.
We haven't.
I'm
pretty excited.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited as well. I think we'll have the break, then we'll come back and we'll introduce him. How's that sound?
Perfect.
All right, now we are back, and I am very pleased to introduce our very special guest for this week's podcast. This is a man who has achieved a whole hell of a lot behind the scenes in the four-wheel drive industry over the last, I don't know, 20-odd years, I guess. I don't want to sell you short, Robin. I don't want to make you sound older than you are either. But Rob was the man behind HEMA Maps before he recently left, and is now heading up a very innovative camper trailer company. Welcome, Rob Borkheim.
Hey, Rico.
How you travelling, mate?
Welcome, Rob.
Awesome. Going awesome.
That's
I
the
just
way.
got outdoors a couple of days ago, so I've sort of refreshed the sunset and the cold wind and the camping parts of me that just love to be fed.
Yeah, no doubt. Now you've got an interesting history yourself within the four-drive industry, mate. You were the son of Henry and Margaret, which is where we get the word HEMA from, H-E for Henry and M-A for Margaret, and that's where HEMA Maps comes from. Tell us a little bit about your time with HEMA.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, was with them for about 30 years. Basically grew up with the business. Started there after doing a geology degree. Sort of gave me a real passion for exploring the earth. And then, as a family, we grew up full driving and camping. And, we just sort of it's kind of in our genes to go down roads we've never been down before. And Mum and Dad were clever enough to turn, the full drive passion and exploring that lots of people do into a business. And together we mapped virtually all of Australia, pretty much focused on all the outback roads and tracks. Had the opportunity to map some of the most remote tracks in the country. Basically, our goal was to just map it out and put it on an awesome map for others to go and explore and discover. So, we're really a part of unlocking and opening up this huge areas of Australia and giving people confidence to explore.
Well, mate, I'm thankful because I've grown up loving HEMA Maps. I've spent countless hours poring over them, and on the odd occasion, it's even saved my bacon a few times. We've been out on a trip and needed to find somewhere to camp, and I'll remember something off the top of my head that I found while poring over one of your maps and suggest a spot. And quite often, it's been the difference between having a good night at camp and chasing your tail all night.
Yeah, great. Well, maps, we love maps, don't we?
Yeah, I do.
That's it.
Explorers, so.
And, back in the day, I guess the biggest advantage there was that they were field checked. We could all go and get topo maps from anywhere, but it may have been 50 years since someone had done a survey there. The HEMA maps that we were used to were regularly field checked. You knew that what was on them was up to date, and that's what we needed.
Yeah, we ran into the map patrols quite often.
You what? Sorry, Rico?
We'd run into the map patrols, the HEMA map patrols out there on the road or off the road quite often.
Yeah, at some point, someone I think thought we had about 20 of them out there. But yeah, it's certainly true that we travelled a lot. So
yeah, well, mate, before we move on, I just got to ask one more question about your time with HEMA. What's your proudest achievement when you were heading up the HEMA Maps team?
Mate, it had to be the Great Desert Track mapping series. I had my mum and dad on a mapping expedition over in the Pilbara, about mid-90s, I think. And, Dad was stuck over there, or Mum and Dad wanted to find a different way back. And I thought, let's go, straight across the guts of Australia. But they didn't have a lot of confidence, a lot of decent mapping across there. So they decided to come, across the bitumen. But Dad came back and said, Rob, there's this whole big vast area in the middle of Australia. We're going to make a map out of it. We won't we won't ever make any money out of it. But we've just got to go and do this. We've got to go do this for our country. And so he said, well, here's a whole area, 5/6 of the continent. So, I'll give you a vehicle and you can find some sponsors and go and map it for us. So I was like, okay, how do we do this?
How good's that?
Just pulling together a team of people, doing what I was doing with Dave Darmody recently, doing some four-wheel drive training. I really knew nothing, but sent all these, newbies out into the outback, single vehicle, and we got it done. In 1998, we launched the Great Desert Track mapping series, and the best bit, like I said before, was just detailing all that out. It was a real passion project for me, real attention to detail. I wanted to get every little bit of information right. Star picket in the desert or a campsite. And what was really exciting was to see the country sort of open up as people had a decent map, and off they went. So for me, I'm just driven to excite people to explore, and I love to see them go, not just sit at home and talk and think about it, but just go, because that's where you learn stuff about yourself and the people you're travelling with, and you discover something new, see life from another side.
Wow, what an awesome story. Yeah, that's just fantastic. Now, mate, what are you doing with yourself now? I know you left HEMA a couple of years ago. What are you up to now?
Yeah, I managed to sort of stumble into a business that I've been around for a few years called Bruder Expedition. So they made some pretty awesome expedition trailers. Some would call them off-road caravans, but we make them and ship them. We make them in Australia and ship them all around the world. In fact, I was there today, and we put one into a container heading off to the US. A couple are heading off to Mongolia next week. So, it's a different way of empowering people to explore. A little bit more comfort than I would like to be used to, but again, it's the heart of the Australian exploration scene with these camper trailers.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also inspiring people around the world. So, so I'm involved as their general manager, just helping them to grow and perform to plan. Like I found on the weekend, my passion is still there to just, whether it's a camper trailer or a map or a four-wheel drive, it's all about the opportunity to get out there and explore.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's right, and the chance to share and the chance to talk about it, and just having a weekend with like-minded folks, particularly after a couple of months where we really haven't had as much chance to get out. Was just such a great weekend, and you brought along that little Bruder, the XP4, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And that thing just went everywhere. We took all the big bad Forbies. It was really very impressive. Bit jaw dropping, I think, for some people. That's an extremely well engineered little bit to get that one.
Yeah, thanks. So they're really lightweight. They've got awesome suspension. Wonderful to tow because of the lightweight, low centre of gravity. Really innovative guys. Two brothers that own it. Well, the name Bruder. They grew up in Germany. So. But really innovative. They used to be involved with Conqueror camper trailers, ran that business, and then sold it about 5 years ago before building their own prototypes, and then said, hey, let's figure out how to do this. So, certainly one of the leading innovative manufacturers in Australia.
I've seen the videos. They look
to be involved.
Amazing. They look absolutely amazing. Dingo, you saw it firsthand, and I've seen some of the videos you've put up there as well. It looked like it handled that stuff down there in Canberra, no trouble at all.
It's just clever. If I had to pick one word, it's clever. It's just everything about it. The geometry, like it's made to go behind a four-wheel drive. It's not just a box with a long drawbar like so many supposed off-road camper trailers are nowadays.
Yep.
It just is such a sensationally well put together, clever little trailer. Yeah, pretty impressive.
Very
Zero
good.
setup, so you don't have to spend a long time camping. You can long time setting up. You can just set up.
That's great. Well, I think we've just put out a hell of an ad for Bruder, so we'll talk about our commission later on, Rob. Mate, you're not getting out of that one, don't worry. Now, we've been talking about the famous explorer Edward John Eyre, who's an interesting character to say the least, but like your family, mate, he's opened up a lot of the country for us. What are the best places you reckon there is to go as a four-wheel driver to experience that country that Eyre would have experienced when he was one of the first ones out there? You know, where can you go to soak up that whole experience?
Yeah, there's a few places. It's pretty easy with Eyre because most of the names, places carry his name. The most obvious one that comes to mind is Lake Eyre, the lowest point in Australia, around 15 metres below sea level, which, in the end was the key place that all these rivers ran to. I know I've listened to your podcast already around Sturt and others that sort of wandered around looking for this inland sea. And this was it. Turned out to be a big salt lake, but you probably already talked about it. But there's three great ways to get to Lake Eyre. One's Lake Eyre South, which is actually the lake that Eyre sort of bumped into. He never quite got to the northern part. They discovered that later. That's right next to the Eden Track. So, just between Murray and William Creek. Of course, there's Halligan's Bay just out from William Creek, about a couple of hours' drive on the western side of Lake Eyre. And then my favourite is probably the access via Murray up to Madigan Gulf. Some fantastic camping at, I think, Mullerina Station. And one of the great things I love about Lake Eyre is just getting out probably on sunset or any time during the day, but particularly on sunset, and just go out and lie in the middle of the lake, see a 360-degree view and just watch the stars come out. And just think about what it'd be like to just come across a place like that in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that would really sum up that experience, wouldn't it? That hasn't changed much out there.
And of course, the way to see it from the air is through right there through out of William Creek.
Yeah, the William Creek Hotel. Yep.
Hour-long flight. And about the best $300 you can spend in Australia, along with a flight of the Bungle Bungles, I reckon. Then there's
a hot tip.
Eyre Peninsula down in South Australia, which is where Eyre started as he travelled up to Lake Eyre, I think. Some great spots down there around Lincoln National Park, Coffin Bay, amazing camping. Really one of my favourite spots down there is, I think it's called Cape Wild. So it's the most eastern point of the Great Australian Bight, which you get to the third part of where to see Eyre stuff in a sec. But there's a great spot right down at Cape Wild where I think a French explorer, Bodine, in a ship found that spot. But really interesting part of that is there's some rocks there which are identical match to some rocks in Antarctica. So, the whole sort of Gondwana theory about how these continents are joined together, well, that's a key spot. You can see the same rock that sits on the continent of Antarctica. So, and of course, that's the easternmost point of the Great Australian Bight. And then you can pretty much follow the Eyre Highway, or the Eyre Cliffs. Basically, that's 1,900 kilometre arc from Port Lincoln right across to Albany. Was a trek on foot that Edward John Eyre did with his mate Baxter and some Aboriginal guides. And that's a long trek. It's a grueling trek to do in a four drive. One of the most beautiful spots where you can go and bump into all this is around Fowler's Bay on the eastern side. Really easy to access from the Eyre Highway. And it's kind of a bit of a junction point of some explorers because Matthew Flinders sailed into there in about 1802, about 40 years earlier. And amazing camping on the coast, beautiful sand dunes. You can have some fun, a bit like Stockton Beach. Really beautiful area. But then, it's about a week-long trek all the way around the Great Australian Bight. There's some pretty gnarly country, lots of forest. You'd think it'd be a beautiful trek all the way along the coast. But often you don't get to see the coast because you're in this endless scrub of the Nullarbor Plain. Of course, that was a real challenging part of Eyre's trip, as you probably talked about. And of course, he lost his good mate Baxter. They're an awesome spot to check out. A few hours in from the Eyre Highway South, for Baxter's Cliff, just an epic spot to stand on the edge of this amazing continent and think about how far it is to Antarctica and just think about, what's it like to get that far and lose your mate to a gunshot, wound in a campsite, and then still have to trek all the way from there to Albany. So,
yeah, it's crazy.
Amazing resilience.
Yeah, we spoke about Baxter and how you never really heard about him when referring to Ayres' adventures and journeys and, discoveries and explorations and all the rest of it. Not like we did with Wheels and, Human Hovel and a few others, Blaxland, Lawson, Wentworth. They all got the same sort of billing. Baxter was there for just about all of it, and you never heard of him. You would never have heard of him.
If he hadn't been shot.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, poor bloke. Well, mate, I think you've done a very good job there of making Dingo and I look pretty ordinary, so well done.
Well, I did my research on a map. Desert Track map.
Can't go wrong. Can't go wrong. All the info's there. Mate, you're a wealth of knowledge. Look, we appreciate you coming on the podcast, mate. If people want to find out more about what you're up to, head to Brooder X. So facebook.com/BrooderX, and you'll find Brooder Expedition stuff there. That is what Rob is up to nowadays, and like I said, you'll see some pretty amazing looking trailers there.
You've got your what's your Instagram page? Sorry, Rob, what's your Instagram page too? Because there's some cool stuff on there. Your personal
Off-Road Explorer.
Off-Road.Explorer, I think, isn't it?
Explorer. Yeah, and go and check out the HEMA Maps website.
Yeah, of course, the HEMA Maps website.
Chester said a map is the window to adventure. So
yep.
I remember working in a map shop. 1989 at uni. We used to have a guy who'd come in about every 3 months, a Friday night. He'd have his $10 or $15. He never went anywhere, but he'd buy a map because he would just spend the next few months just poring over this map. Could be anywhere in the world. But, he was just a true map lover.
I wonder what happened to that bloke.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, he had some amazing adventures. Never cost him much more than $15.
Nice.
Very good. Yeah, the HEMA Cloud, that's an awesome resource as well. I use that almost every week.
Good stuff. Well, keep up the good work, boys.
Thank you, mate. Well done.
Thank you, Rob.
Unlocking Australia and following the footsteps of the great explorers.
Well, mate, hopefully you'll join us on one of those journeys one day. That would just be the icing on the cake, I think. Excellent.
Love that.
All right, well, that was Edward John Eyre, the life and times, the adventures of, the controversies, the highs, the lows, pretty much everything to do with the bloke's life. I think he was an incredible, incredible man who did some amazing things. Yeah, what do you reckon, Dingo?
Mate, sensational. That was it's a cool story, and of course, such a that sort of expanse of country that he covered that is actually really quite accessible. He wasn't just sort of the places he went are places that we can visit now. As Rob was saying, there's so much there that you can see, you can relive.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, look, I think it's time we wrap this one up. Now, if you would like to follow us on our socials, Dingo's, yours is?
I'm at Dingo Dave 4x4, and of course, I'm also at Australian Off-Road Academy if you want to get out and get your four-wheel drive dirty.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure Rob can vouch for that as well. You can catch me at Rico4x4. You can also check out the Australia Rediscovered Facebook page. There you'll find out stuff about, obviously, our podcast, our tag-along tours, and our new show that we've got coming up later in the year that Dingo and I will be doing that's pretty much based on this sort of subject matter. So if you're into the podcast, you're going to love the show when that comes later on. So go give that a bit of a look. Also, check us out on YouTube as well. You look for Australia Rediscovered, you'll find the channel there. If you'd like to find out more about being involved on our tag-along tours, where Dingo Dave and I will take you out and show you some of these amazing places in the flesh, and you'll get to see just how bad we sound and smell for real. By all means, take the plunge and head over to rico.com.au, jump on that tag-along tour page there, and you'll find out all the information. We've got a couple of tours that are actually up and active now, so that's a great opportunity to get out and stretch the legs and see some pretty amazing parts of the country with at least one good bloke. Dingo will be there and I'll be there as well. So we hope that you'll join us for that.
And they're trailer-friendly campers, trailer-friendly trips too. I think
that's right. Very important. Very important.
Not doing anything crazy. You can have the comforts and you can still explore.
That's right. All righty, well, we're going to close it up there now. As I like to say, guys, stop making excuses and start making plans. Let's just get out there and hopefully we'll run into you on the track. We'll catch you next time. Cheers, folks.